science cannot give us everything, all the information there is, and that dance also does not, but together they really can give us a more holistic view of the world around us.
What fuels a multi-passionate life? I'm Jessica Wan, and in this podcast, I interview people who straddle two completely different worlds. I call them Ampersands, and we are collectively designing the Ampersand Manifesto. I'm excited to be talking with Dr. Sloka Iyengar, neuroscientist and Bharatanatyam dancer, who is passionate about relieving suffering through science and the arts. For her Ph.D. and postdoc work, she studied the circuits in the brain that lead to the generation and propagation of epileptic seizures. She's worked with adults and children with epilepsy to develop better therapeutic strategies. Sloka is also an award-winning Bharatanatyam performer and practitioner who has created productions that explore the many points of convergence between dance and neuroscience. She is passionate about using dance to facilitate healing and creative aging. Sloka, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
For listeners who may not be familiar with Bharatanatyam as an art form, how do you typically describe it?
So Bharatanatyam is a 2,000-year-old dance form that originated in the temples of South India. It is a traditional art form, so it is transmitted through teacher to disciple. For the longest time, it was oral tradition. A lot of that is still maintained, of course, with videos and photos. That's a bit different, but the connection between the guru or the teacher, whose guru is so much more than a teacher, and the disciple or the student is a very important part of this tradition. As far as what the tradition entails, it is a codified set of movements, hand gestures, facial expressions, and the whole point of Bharatanatyam is to communicate. So we are always communicating to the audience. There is also a very, very strong devotional aspect, and the devotion could be to a deity, to a god or a goddess, but not necessarily. It could be to something that we feel is higher than ourselves. But the concept of devotion, which is called bhakti, really permeates every aspect of dance. So it's much more than a performance. It is the actual learning. For me, it's how I tie my sari. It is how I iron my sari. And it is all of those things that really make up not just the performance, which might be 5 minutes, but it is everything that goes into the learning and sharing.
As a young person growing up in India, your work at an animal shelter sparked an interest in the brain. Now you've been in the field of neuroscience for almost 20 years. What is exciting and fascinating to you now as a scholar and teacher?
Thinking about consciousness and what makes us conscious. How do we know that we are conscious? And is my puppy conscious? I think those questions of consciousness and what makes an animal conscious is something that I think I've gained more of an interest in. Not that I know more about it, but I definitely am more curious about it. As a practitioner of science and dance and really trying to articulate those links, how exactly dance affects the brain and what it is in the brain or in our nervous systems that allows and enables us to appreciate art.
How does consciousness relate to Bharatanatyam and even this way of life as you go about your day?
I have to say, I don't know, because I don't know what is life without Bharatanatyam. But I do see it in my older adult dancers, how being able to express themselves through dance changes. I don't know if it changes their consciousness. I don't know how we would know that, but I do know it changes their perception of themselves and it changes their perception of how they view the world around them.
What are some points of convergence that you see between dance and neuroscience?
There's several in the way dance is taught, but for example, the pedagogy of Bharatanatyam and neuroscience. So, there is a very clear structure, and, one might think that having this structure is stifling. Everything is written down. And when I was doing my undergrad back in Ahmedabad, you read all these like thick books and it makes you feel like everything that should be discovered has already been discovered, right, like it's like, oh my god, there's like books and books of about this subject or that subject. But the point, which I found out later as I was doing my PhD, is that you have a framework by which you can understand the world around you. And I think that's similar pedagogy, the framework. So Bharatanatyam gives us a framework of hand gestures, of facial expressions. You can use those to tell your own stories. And similarly with neuroscience, you have a framework for asking questions. So we know we have this information from the past. These are some of the hypotheses we can have. And then try and address them. Science, I don't know if it answers all questions. I mean, we don't know what all the questions are, so we don't know if we can answer all questions. But I think as disciplines and as ways of knowledge, of understanding who we are, perhaps science is like, one angle of like the quantified information of the world around us. But then there's things, and I, give this example to my students. I show a video of my puppy rolling around in the dirt. So it's like a spring day and he loves like rolling around. And his happiness or his joy is probably not something that can be quantified. I mean, I guess we could find ways to like quantify how many times he rolls or how many times he does, sniffs or whatever. But that uninhibited joy is something that perhaps science, or at least the science that we're doing right now cannot give us. So thinking of different ways of knowledge and how they really complement each other rather than contradict, I think that's definitely one of the points of convergence. In Bharatanatyam, we have a lot of depictions of animals. People might have seen Lord like Ganesha, who has his head is that of an elephant. We depict peacocks, and there's a lot of references to nature and to animals. One of the series called Creatures on the Move, I take animals in my neighborhoods, I live in Uptown Manhattan, and talk about their nervous system, how is the nervous system what it is. So for example, if I take a worm and think about like what is the worm's nervous system, but also try to recreate that movement through dance. And it's been amazing to think about just what the diversity we have around us, even in a city like New York City, where somebody might think there are not that many animals, but thinking about, that what makes that animal's movement unique. The act of observation, I think, is an act of love. So you have to observe like each like segment that's moving, one after another. And how could you not, right? Like, how could you not be in awe of the world around us?
I love hearing about the storytelling aspect and how very respectful this art form is, as we humans evolved from animals, and we need animals in our world to survive on this planet.
One of the books of Bharatanatyam, it's called Abhinaya Darpana, and Darpana literally means a mirror. So it literally means it's a mirror of everything in the world around us. So, we might do it in a way that's stylized. We might do it with props, with costumes, with what, but at the end of the day, it is still a mirror of our lives. And how amazing that a dance form that's 2000 years old has the framework for us to think about our lives.
In your work as a scientist, you've collaborated with a wide range of people in major pharmaceutical companies, nonprofit organizations, and academia. What kind of teamwork and collaboration needs to happen to make science really work as a public good?
As a scientist, I will say that scientists can do much better. So, for example, one of the things is jargon, right? And, the jargon that we use, the words that we use may be understandable to a small set of people. For example, people studying epilepsy or seizure disorders, but may not be understandable to people that, don't happen to study those things. So I think jargon, making things understandable, but in a way that's not condescending. I think that's very, very important because and people can tell when you're being condescending. It's not, whether it's in the written word or spoken word. And that's a skill, honestly, we're not taught. At least I wasn't taught in my graduate work. The only reason I gravitate towards it was I love words. And even as a child, I would like write for the Times of India. I've always, as a child, I would sit and admire the shapes of words and letters. And I was really privileged to have that experience growing up as a child. But it's not really training that scientists are given. And I think we saw what happens when we don't learn how to talk to non-scientists during the pandemic. So, the fact that recommendations were changing wasn't because people were making things up, right? It was because we just know more. And how do we build scientific literacy in a way that's we're not talking down to people, we're not using jargon, and because that's a way of exclusion in a way, that we're really thinking about that two-way communication and not just I'm going to tell you, about science. I think scientists just need to do a lot better as far as getting to know our audiences, learning how to communicate in a way that's respectful and not condescending.
How do you think your identity as a dancer, as an artist, has helped you as a scientist?
I mean, so many things. I think the first of all is that, Bharatanatyam is a way of communication. The way that, we are taught is it's not so much about how straight your hands are or how, it is about that, but secondarily, the first thing is that you always are communicating. And I think that maybe in a subconscious way is always there. For example, I worked at a neurology clinic working with children that have refractory epilepsy. So they may have seizure disorders from infancy, and really learned how to listen, first of all, even before talking, but listening to parents of children with epilepsies. And in one conversation, I remember this so well, they were asking me, oh, what did you do before this? And, I was saying, oh, postdoc, blah, blah. And one of the immediate reaction of the mother was that, well, my child is not a rat, which is, I would say the same thing if somebody said that to me. I used to pride myself, I know how to communicate with everybody. But clearly, there's always things to learn. So for that population, I probably shouldn't have said the things the way I did. But given that Bharatanatyam is always about communication, it's outward in a way that is, we are taught about, the sequence of events, for example, how to communicate a sequence of events through dance. And what does that mean? So, for example, just as an example, if I say that my friend is to my right, if I just say that, I shouldn't be doing anything else to my right because people won't know if it's my friend or if it's somebody else. So even demarcating characters and having clarity, I think it's something that just comes up in choreography because we have to be clear. The sequence of events has to be logical. For example, if through my eyes, if I'm showing a house versus a mountain, there has to be a difference because a house is going to be much smaller than a mountain. And if I show stars, they're going to have to be even higher. So, and I think that clarity, that sequence of events that is very, very logical for a conversation or for a story, really does help in science and scientific writing and communication.
Let's pause here for a moment to reflect on this question. How could you improve communication in your work to be more clear? Outside of hosting this podcast, I partner with leaders in the workplace as they rise up. Perhaps you've gotten a promotion, landed a new role, or taken on a lot more responsibility, and you need a trusted sounding board to support you as you support your team. I coach individuals and leadership teams to rise to the challenge with my Ampersand blend of analytical and creative. If any of this intrigues you, reach out to me at jessicawan.com. Now, back to the show. A current project of yours is Vichar, an online production where you talk about the various points of connection between the arts and the sciences. How did this idea come to be, and what do you hope people will gain from this project?
The idea actually, it had been around for a while, but it was 2022 March. Every March, neuroscientists come together in something called the Brain Awareness Week. So it's just a week for people to share their excitement about neuroscience, about, ranging from really clinical work to all sorts of things. I knew there was a lot to say, but I wanted to create a framework for articulating these convergences between Bharatanatyam and neuroscience. There have been people looking at sciences and arts in general, but what I aim to do is very specifically look at Bharatanatyam, A, because no one else has done it in this way. And secondly, I do think Bharatanatyam is very unique in terms of what it is and what it gives us. From what started as an idea, it's like, I should think about it and write about it. It has led to some really interesting collaborations. For example, I was invited to a conference last year in Denver, which was for a group of people that are caregivers. So these people, they go into homes if there are children from 0 to 5 years old. And I was able to bring Bharatanatyam and neuroscience on the same stage by thinking about caregiving through the lens of neuroscience and Bharatanatyam. So amazing experience. I was able to do lullabies. Again, bringing back science cannot give us everything, all the information there is, and that dance also does not, but together they really can give us a more holistic view of the world around us. So for this event, we talked about the neuroscience of caregiving and thinking about what's happening in the brain and combining it with Bharatanatyam, with lullabies, with just so many ways in which we give care to people, to plants, to things around us. And another example was thinking about learning and teaching. So, learning and teaching, again, they're like huge topics in neuroscience, in psychology, in philosophy too. And I collaborated with a scientist who looks at songbirds. He wants to understand in this particular songbird or zebrafinch, the father bird teaches the male bird. And the girl birds or the female birds can vocalize, but they don't sing. But they mate for life. So the song of the boy is probably the most important thing he's going to do because that's what attracts. It's a mating song. And he was talking about error detections, trying to understand how do they know that they've made an error. And, he had a whole bunch of things about what particular neurons probably tell the bird that he's made an error and he should go practice. And then I was able to think more largely about learning and teaching in Bharatanatyam. So this whole cycle of, we learn, we perfect as much as we can. I don't know if we ever do, but then the whole point is to transmit and to carry on that knowledge to others. So those have been some really interesting things that have come out of this convergence.
That's such an interesting analogy. You've been awarded fellowships to use dance for community service, the most recent one being Sukasa by the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, a community arts engagement program that places artists and organizations at senior centers. What have you learned from this experience?
First of all, a lot of things. I think my view of aesthetics or what I consider beautiful, what I consider symmetric has totally changed because with people 65 and older, many of them may have arthritis, many of them, whatever. I don't always know. And it's all beautiful. They can all do a particular hand gesture, and there is still beauty in it. And I always make it a point, again, to say it's not about what is straight and what, it's about feeling. If I'm doing this gesture with my hands, and if I'm doing it with feeling, it will be beautiful by default. I think my view of aesthetics has definitely evolved, to be quite honest, working with them. Also, when I first started, again, this was last year, I had no idea of how it would be received. Again, it's a dance form that's kind of came from a very particular cultural context. And what I always try to do is make it universal. So take aspects of this dance form, for example, the codified language of emotions. And we all feel emotions. So it's perhaps a bit easier to relate. My job is to always bring out the universality of this dance form. I'm always pleasantly surprised. I think what people get out of it is just amazing. And I think my view of aesthetics, my view of what I can share, for example. And I think people, at least I've been very lucky to work with people who are also very forgiving. So, for example, if I do a movement where people feel a bit unstable, they feel like they can tell me, first of all, and then I can quickly adapt or, do something so that they don't feel unstable. So I'm so glad that my dancers feel like they can tell me. What can we do to retain the beauty, but then also make sure that, my dancers feel safe and they are safe. So it's been a blessing, definitely a privilege to work with them.
You occupy such a unique space connecting these two disciplines. What advice do you have for other ampersands who might be seeking out a deeper connection or who hope to see their worlds intersect in a more meaningful way?
From my personal experience, I would say do it because there's never gonna be a perfect time. And we can always wait for when is my idea perfect. For me, at least, there's never gonna be a time when I feel like I'm doing, 150% on both of those things. But also finding a way to be comfortable with, so if I write a small blog post, I wish I could spend 2 hours, for example, but I cannot. And what is, I shouldn't say good enough because it makes it seem like it's not good, but what are we okay with individually? And then, trying, because I think that is the only way to move ahead. The two things, at least from my journey, just do it and find a way that's safe. So for example, for me it was, this blog Vichar. And I still remember thinking, if it's a failure, that's okay. I would have tried, I would have done something, and having a version of what we are comfortable with.
How are you defining success for your Vichar?
I think the only thing I would say is if I'm having fun. And I feel like the day when I don't feel excited about it is probably when I know that it's, I should change things or do something else. But as long as I'm enjoying and I'm having fun, and I think it's providing something to the community of scientists, of artists, of people who might have this convergence but don't know what to do with it. I think as long as those things are there, and I think the more, maybe this is a bit selfish, but if I don't have fun, then I don't do it. For now, it is that.
I love it. Having fun and being true to yourself. Through these interviews, we're collectively creating principles for leading a multi-passionate life. What would you like to add to the Ampersand Manifesto?
We may not always know how a certain thing or a certain activity is going to pan out in the future. For example, when I said yes, I teach evolution at the Museum of Natural History. I said yes because, of course, that's such an amazing opportunity, but I didn't know what else could come out of it. And looking back to where I am now, I think the ideas about evolution, about animals, about ecology, a lot of those come from teaching that course. So I think perhaps like enjoying the journey for what it is and not necessarily thinking about where this is going to lead. When I started taking music lessons a few years ago, I never wanted to sing in public, but I think, I realized more and more I was learning music. For someone who's very soft spoken, I think it really gave me an opportunity to use my voice in a way that was helpful in many other settings. So, if something is interesting, if something evokes joy, there are more reasons to do it than not.
Sloka, it's been such a pleasure talking with you. Folks, you can check out Sloka's work at slokaiyengar.net, and we'll link to her website in our show notes. If you liked this show, hit like, subscribe, and share with your friends and fellow Ampersands. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, feel free to leave us a review. I had a chance to listen back to my conversation with Sloka, and I wanted to share a few key takeaways. 1. Nature and animals are such an inspiration for both her work in dance and in science. And loved her quote, "An act of observation is an act of love." That made me stop in my tracks. And ever since this interview, I've been looking, listening, and pausing a little more in my own neighborhood in Berkeley. The birds, squirrels, deer, I feel their presence more, and I observe them. 2. This interview expanded my perspective by inviting me to think about my place in a long line of descendants, whether that's musicians, coaches, mothers, Asian women. Bharatanatyam is steeped in history, and so is science in the way that research builds upon past research. History matters so much to our understanding of the world, and people have done so much work in every field that paves the way for us to explore even further. 3. I've been reflecting on my own answers to this question: what is beauty? Shloka shared that working with older adults has shifted her perspective on aesthetics. Our culture is so geared towards beauty being only associated with youth. But how do we find beauty in the imperfect, the asymmetric, the aged? There is that old saying that inner beauty is more important than outer beauty. But I think you really have to look harder for inner beauty. And you have to look with more than just your eyes. It's more of a feeling, a sense, and a connection.
Especially if I've not warmed up, I mean, it's like a very physically exhausting thing. So starting sometimes a bit stiff, a bit tired, but I can feel a smile, on my face. So, which is amazing.